Hello and I welcome you to the Big Fat Mixed Media Tribe. Today we will be making an autumn decoration for the house, and I already cut this tag-shaped base for my decoration from an old cardboard box. And I want to use a gel print. We will be using a couple of lesser used techniques to make our decoration today, so stick around to see them. And since my tag is quite big, I am using the A4 gel plate. This plate is a little bit different from the usual gel plates. It feels to the touch more like the silicone forms you use for baking in your kitchen. And it is not see-through. It is this grayish material, not very inspiring, but it does the job very well. And this plate is made by a Spanish company, and the price was very reasonable. For the 8-4 size plate I paid something around 20 euros, so the price is very reasonable and it does a really good job. And I've decided to use the pastels, the dry pastels, for my background. Lately I have found myself trying not to use acrylic paints because I seem not to be managing with the paints getting darker as they dry, and I'm not happy that my mixed media pieces usually start to look much darker after some time after they've been finished. So I'm trying different techniques, and one of them, which I like a lot, is using dry pastels. And I have these very cheap school grade dry pastel crayons, which are quite hard in comparison, for example, to the Ferraris of the dry pastel world, which are pan pastels. So pan pastels, you would be able to use just an ordinary brush and get the pastel straight from the pan to your surface on which you are working. But here I need to get the loose powder, so I'm taking a crayon and scratching it along a piece of paper just to obtain a little pile of the pastel dust on my paper. I'm choosing colors which remind of a forest floor, since we will be making an autumn scene. I chose a stencil and colors which sort of remind of a moss, of fallen leaves. So I took these green colors, orangey yellowy colors, and some teal maybe, and magenta for some accents. And I'm using ordinary soft makeup sponge to apply the powder to the plate. The beautiful thing about this plate is that it's rather sticky. So first of all, stencil sticks to it really well, and I don't need to fix it with a tape or do anything else for the stencil to stay in place. It stays in place beautiful on its own. And also the loose powder of the pastels sticks to the surface of the plate, so it's really easy to work with it. And I'm not even changing the sponge between the colors, because I'm quite happy with colors mixing between or among themselves, and to get these gradients of color on my gel plate. I'm trying to concentrate the lighter colors in the middle and going with the brighter colors on the outside edges. Yes, I'm adding magenta for an accent. I will be using a vintage book page to lift the pastel from the gel plate, so the yellowy tone of the book page will mute the pastel powders a little bit, so I'm okay with using bright colors. Oh, see how beautiful it is! And I will lift the powder using white acrylic paint. So I'm adding little dots of paint all over the plate, and then I will spread the color using a brayer. I'm choosing a white paint again just because the page with which I will lift the color has this yellowish tone, so I didn't want to add any more tone. So I'm spreading the white paint thinly so that I can see through the powdery design, the pastel design, and I'm pressing the vintage book page on top of it, and so the paint will do the job of lifting the powder off the gel plate, and most importantly, the paint also sets the powder, so the powder is not loose anymore, it is glued, if I can say so, glued to the page. And let's very, very carefully lift it, because I've torn the corner of the page, because this is a vintage paper, the real vintage paper, and it's quite fragile, so I have to be very, very careful. And the result is stunning, if I may say so myself. I'm really happy with this. So let's put it aside, and I'm preparing all the other papers for my tag. Lately I'm trying to use my decorative papers because I have lots of them. So I just put my hand into the drawer with decorative papers and got out the first one that was there, and it was this beautiful teal color. So I've decided to go with it. I am also tearing the edges of the printed paper, gel printed paper, which will make the third layer of the background. And I will go on and glue all these 3 layers together. Yes, I'm cutting the very roughly, without measuring anything. I'm just rounding the top corners of my papers to fit on this tag-shaped base. And I will glue them all together on top of each other using liquid gel medium. So when this is done, let's use some ephemera. And these are stamps that I stamped on an ordinary brown tape. And I usually create lots of them. For example, in the evening when I'm watching television, I have the stamps and colored pencils in front of me. I just stamp a whole line of stamps of mushrooms, bugs, or anything else, and I color them using colored pencils, and then I have ephemera that I can use on my projects. So I had these mushrooms already painted, so I'm gluing the brown tape down, and then some other pieces of ephemera. The one in the middle you remember probably from the microscope slides project where I made labels, and then there is one more label which I chose simply because there are 2 tiny mushrooms on it, and which turned out to be a sticker. I didn't even know it was a sticker before. And now to the borders. I took out several stamps, and I'm making a border using a black archival ink. I chose different stamps so that the border is not monotone, and I'm going around the border of the tag both horizontally and vertically. Here you see me using a tiny piece of paper because I don't want the long narrow stamp to go too deep into my tag, but just stay on the border. And the last one is this round dotted stamp. So I like the versatility of the border, and that the border is not monotone, just one stamp all around it. So on to the next layer. I will be doing mushrooms later, so I wanted some background, like foresty background for my mushrooms. And for that I wanted to use some flower stencils. And it turned out to be quite difficult because all my flower stencils are quite intricate, meaning that they are the holes of the stencils are quite thin, and I found it that it was quite difficult to use embossing powder on the stencil like that. So I chose the only stencil I had where the flowers were bigger, and this stencil is from Clarity Stamp, and it is quite stylized, but I wasn't sure if I should use it or not. But since this was the only stencil I had where the flowers were the right size for the tag, I've used it. So I will have quite a stylized flowers in the background of my very realistic mushrooms. I think I'm happy with it because I like the proportions of these flowers. So I'm using white embossing powder. And here come the mushrooms. So I made the stencil from the same cardboard box. I cut out the stencil. I just roughly I just roughly drew. Yes, I roughly drew the mushrooms and cut them out using a cutting knife. And now I'm using my embossing paste or structure paste to fill in the mushroom shape, and it takes quite a lot of structure paste, but I'm happy to do that because I've had this jar for quite a long time, and you know that the structure paste tends to get dry very quickly, and I have already brought it back to life I think twice with PVA glue and with another structure paste which was very liquid. So this really is coming to the end of its life, so I'm happy to use a lot of it so that I can get a new jar. So let's leave the stencil, and here are our mushrooms. I'm using a brush just to smooth out a little bit the rough edges. You know, when you use stencil you get a very sharp, precise edges which are not ideal for my mushrooms, so I'm just using the slightly wet brush to sort of caress the sharpness away from my mushrooms, both on the hats or heads, how do you call them, heads of the mushrooms, and the stems of the mushrooms. And then it's a matter of letting them dry. I actually left them dry overnight, and I continued working on my tag the next morning. So here we are, the mushrooms are dry, and now it's time to color them. And I will be using color pencils, but these are ink pencils. So again, I'm trying to stay away from the acrylic paints. Let's see what happens. I quite like the ink pencils because they keep the intensity of the color even after a longer period of time. So I'm using reds and yellows and browns to color my mushrooms. And I sped up this part of the video so that you don't need to watch every little tiny stroke of a pencil. But you don't need to be very precise here. Those are mushrooms. This is your art piece. The way you color them, it doesn't need to be realistic. It doesn't need to be very precise. Just be happy with using the color and getting color on to your work's surface. I'm using a darker brown on the outside edges of my mushroom, and I will be slightly darkening the stems of the mushrooms also. This is not a painting, so the mushrooms do not need to be very realistic, so I'm just grabbing some colors. As you see on the yellow mushroom, I've added some red, I've added some blue on the red mushroom just for the interest and to repeat a little bit the colors of the background. And darker colors on the outside, lighter colors in the middle, just to add a little bit of the visual dimension also to my mushrooms. And just a little bit of gray on the stems to take away the stark whiteness of the structure paste. And normally I would use a charcoal pencil to outline objects on my work, but since I had the ink pencils already on the table, I'm using the black and brown ink pencil to create shadows around the mushrooms, and also to create shadows around the ephemera that I glued down previously, and to create shadows on my flowers. I just draw the lines with the pencil and then go over the lines with just a slightly damp brush. Yes, and I'm going around the little pieces of paper also to give them border and to sort of tie all my elements together. And since I didn't like the pinkness of this one ephemera piece, I went over it with brown ink too. And then I have in my stash this artificial moss. And here you see me debating with myself, do I need to glue it on this tag or not? Is it too realistic? Does it remind you of a school project if I'm gluing the moss down? But then I thought, what the heck, it is there, so why not? I like it. Let's glue the moss down too. So this tag sort of walks the line between abstract and realistic. And of course, mushroom needs white dots. I'm using a white acrylic marker to put the white dots on my red mushroom. And since the ink will slightly bleed into the acrylic paint, it will naturally get darker on the outer edges where the shadow is. So this is how it looks in the close-up. I really like how the mushrooms turned out. Slightly grungy, slightly realistic, slightly abstract. Very happy with it. I also added some some black splatters to my tag, and I tied the green ribbon bow which I dyed with acrylic inks. So please press the like button if you enjoyed watching creation of this autumn tag, and choose another video to watch to get inspired. And I see you soon. Bye bye.